So good morning, guys. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. So basically, we'll continue from where we stopped in CSS, and I believed from the last class we learned about CSS box model. So the box model actually holds some properties within itself, which basically are four of them: the content area, the border, the padding, and the margin. So as I said from the last class, I mentioned that in this particular class, we'll be going in depth on how each of these properties actually work. And also you'll get to know that within each of these properties are sub properties under them. So we'll be looking at that too, and we'll also, have a quick demo on how each of these properties work on VS Code. So for the first section of today's class, we have the padding. So I believe this is something we already know about from the class we held last week, Thursday, which was about the CSS box model. So under the padding section, we'll get to know what a padding is, which we already know. That's for those that were in that class. But if you are new here, no problem. I'll go over this again. So we'll also get to know about the padding properties. Yes, so within the padding are some individual properties that can actually stand alone on their own. By that I mean these properties can get styled independently without having to use the general padding property. So we'll be looking into the padding top, the padding bottom, the padding left, and the padding right. Also, we'll be looking into the padding property and we'll be seeing how the values are being, distributed because from what I got yesterday, that's just doing some small research. The last class we had, the padding we used then only had a single value. But here we'll be looking at how different values can be used within the padding property and it would also affect each of these properties here. So we'll be seeing that too. And also a quick demo on padding, which we all know about. That's basically where we get to the part where we go into the practical session on VS Code. So the second section we have for today's class is the border section, which I already talked about last week. But here we'll be focusing more on the border properties and the border values also. As you can see on the screen, we have the border properties to be border top, border bottom, border left, and border right. And each of these properties can actually be styled independently. So you would know that that means they don't need the overall border property to, get styled because the overall one actually affects everything together. But we'd also see how it could be used to style a particular property you want. Yeah. And also a quick demo on border, which will be done on VS Code. And lastly, we have the margin section. As we all know, this is the outermost area of, the HTML element. So we'll look at its definition, its properties, which you can see to be margin top, bottom, left and right. And also we'll have a quick demo on this and we'll see how, everything works and how they are all put in place on the HTML element. So for the first section, we have the padding section. So for those that are new to this class, don't worry, I'll go over what a padding is again, and you'll get to, see some other things that we didn't touch in the last class. So the padding can be described as the area directly surrounding the content area of the HTML element. Yes, so from the last class, we talked about the box model, which houses the padding, the margin, the border, and the content area. So I believe we all know that where the HTML element is being rendered, that's the space it takes on the screen, is the content area. So the area that comes after that particular space is known as the padding. So what that basically means is that the padding is what covers the entire content area completely. So it surrounds it. That's from top, bottom, left, and right. It covers it completely. And we also know that the padding area is always in between the content area and the border area. So That's already like a quick heads up to the next section, which is the border section. So by this statement, you would know that the border area actually comes after the padding area. So that's that for that. Let's move. So the padding property is a shorthand property for the following properties. And these properties are the padding top, the padding bottom, the padding left, and the padding right. Yes. So we didn't really go over this when we treated the box model, and that's because we're focusing only on, the actual, the main properties within the box model. That's as a whole. But now you can see that the padding property is a shorthand for each of these properties. So what shorthand basically means is that the padding property can actually give you the power to style these four properties at once. Yes. So we would see how that works, but then from last week's class, I remember that we only used one value to style, the padding, and that value actually affected all these four properties. So we'd also see how we can style a particular property we want, and how we can also style them independently using this shorthand. So let's quickly see what these properties are all about. So first we have the padding top. As we all know, this is the property that describes the top padding of HTML elements. And this property can be used to set slash adjust the top padding of the elements. Yeah. So like I said before, each of these properties can actually be styled independently on their own. So you might probably you know, want to style the top padding of an HTML element without having a padding on the left or on the right or on the bottom. You probably just want it to be at the top. So this property allows you to do that. So that's basically what the padding top is used for. Next, we have the padding bottom property. So this one, of course, from the word bottom, you would know that it describes the bottom of the HTML element. By that we mean the down layer. That's the padding top is for the top, the padding bottom is for the bottom of the HTML element, the base. So the padding bottom describes the bottom padding of the HTML element, and the property is also used to set the bottom padding to any value you want. So this property actually affects only the bottom and not any other property also. Then also we have the padding left, which describes the left padding of the HTML element. The padding left property is used to adjust the left padding of the HTML element. So of course this one is just for the left padding. It doesn't affect any other padding within the element. And lastly we have the padding right. So this basically is used, to describe and define the right padding of the HTML element. And the padding right is also used to set slash adjust the right padding of the HTML element. So I believe now we all know how each of these, properties work. So until then, just hang tight and we'll get to see how it, plays out on VS Code. So yes, for the sake of, more better understanding, this is like a pictorial representation of the padding. So as you can see on this picture, the inner box actually holds the content. That's this particular square that you're seeing here. This one, the one on a lighter gray color. So that holds the content. That's the area where your HTML element is being rendered. So if it's a text, that's the entire space the text takes. So the other space surrounding it, that's this space here, which has arrows I used to label them, actually describes, how this padding appears. So you can see this is the padding top, which is designated as this area here. That's from this entire top, sorry. And also we have the padding bottom, which is, the entire space here. And then the padding left, and the padding right. So let's move on. So yeah, like I said before, from last week's class, we talked about the padding, but we also used a single value in the padding, which when you do that, it actually affects all the elements at once, since the padding property is a shorthand property. So from this section, we'll be seeing how you can also style each of these properties individually using the padding shorthand. So the padding shorthand property can be assigned a set of values ranging from one value to four values. Yeah. So for now, the one we are conversant with is the one with one value, which is what we used in last week's class. So if the padding property is assigned a single value, that is, padding is 10 pixels, then all independent properties will have 10 pixels. Yes, so we basically saw this from the last class when we had our padding to be assigned a single value of 50 pixels. So the single value is going to affect the entire property of that padding. By that we mean the padding top, the padding bottom, the padding left, and the padding right. So each of these properties will have the same values. But we'd also see how we could, style different the properties with different values too. So yeah, now if the padding property is assigned two values, that is, the padding is 10 pixels, then with a space 20 pixels. This is actually a CSS syntax. So if we have it to be in this form, it would actually affect the first value would actually affect the top and the bottom padding. So by that we mean that the top and the bottom padding will have 10 pixels, and then the right and the left padding will have 20 pixels. So you can see that the two values we have in this padding property actually affects them in a group manner. So you have the top and the bottom to be assigned with the first value, then the right and the left will be assigned with the second value. So using these two values, it gives you the power to have a particular padding for the top and the bottom, and also a different type of padding you would want to have on the left and the right. So that's how this assignment property with two values work. So next we have the occurrence of three values. So if the padding property is assigned three values, that is, the padding is assigned 10 pixels, 20 pixels, and 30 pixels. These values would also be shared among the four properties, since the padding property is a shorthand for the four properties we've talked about before. So basically here, the top padding will have 10 pixels. That's, the first value. Then the value in the middle, or what you would also call the second value, would be assigned to the right and the left padding. So the right and the left padding here will have 20 pixels, and then the last value, which is the third value, would be assigned to the bottom padding. So you basically have this to be top, right and left, and bottom. So that's how they are arranged in this particular form when you give your padding three values. So that's that for this. So we all know the next one we'll be seeing is going to be the one with four values, which gives you the power to style all of them independently. So yes, if the padding property is assigned four values, the padding is 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 40 pixels. Now this would actually be distributed among each of the padding. But then for this particular format, it has, okay, I can see there's a typo there, three values. Yeah, it's meant to be four. So don't really focus on that, but just know that this describes the padding property with four values. So like I said, the padding property here is assigned 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, and 40 pixels. So each of these values would actually be assigned to each of the padding properties, but then there's a particular order it follows. So it doesn't follow the order of top, bottom, then right and left. No, it follows the order of top, right, bottom, left. So what this basically means is that the first value will be assigned to the top padding of the element, then the second value will be assigned to the right padding. So you have the first and the second to be top right, and then the third value will be assigned to the bottom property, that's 30 pixels, and then we have the last value to be assigned to the left padding. So you can see that this particular form, follows a particular order. So you need to know the order of this property using these values so you don't get confused. So let's just still look at it for a while. It starts with the top, which is then followed by the right, then the bottom, and then the left. The left is the last, the top is the first. Top, right, bottom, left. So that's how it works when the padding property is assigned four values. Four. So yeah, we'll be looking on a quick demo on how the padding property works. So without wasting time, let's quickly go to VS Code. Okay, so here we are on VS Code. I'll be creating a new HTML file and CSS for this. So, like we all know, we'll be using the external CSS method, which would require us to create an independent CSS file. So, I believe we all know that already. So, we called index.html. I would have our CSS to be style.css. So, we'll start with the boilerplate and also would link our CSS file to the HTML. Yeah, so here would start with some block elements, mostly paragraphs and headings. Okay, let's have some headings also. Yeah, so I believe this is enough. So we'll be using the class property within this HTML element. So I have the class name to be pad. So we all know how to do this with the class name, starting with the full stop and then the class name. Yeah. So for this, we'll be starting with the padding top, which will be starting with the independent element. So we are not going to use the shorthand straight away. We'll start with each of those independent padding properties. So we'll start with the padding top. We'll give this 40 pixels. So before saving this, let's see how it looks on the screen. Okay, so this is basically what we have now. Okay, let's quickly give this a background so we'll know where the content area stops for this. So background will be green. Yes, so this is what we basically have now without adding any padding. So this entire space where this green color is being housed, as we all know, is the content area, yeah, from last week's class. So now we'll be using each of these independent padding properties on this HTML element. So we'll start with the padding top, 40 pixels. So we'll save and go back to our browser, and yes, you can notice a difference from the top now. So basically, this is how the padding top actually works, and you can see that it also takes the same color as the content area. So the background property affects the content area and the padding. The only property it doesn't affect is the border and the margin. So both the padding and the content area actually look like they have the same properties, but they are not. The content area for this element that we see on the screen, let me zoom in a bit. Yeah, for this CSS padding still ends somewhere here. That's somewhere just a little above where this text stops. That's vertically. So from that particular spot to the top of this part is actually the padding top. So that's how the padding top is being defined. So we'll be applying the padding bottom next. We change this to bottom. We save this, you'll notice the same difference, but now it's not going to be from the top, it's going to be from the bottom of the element. Okay, yeah, so this is basically how the padding bottom also works too. So as you can see, we have this amount of space, you know, below the content area, which stops just somewhere under this G, somewhere there. So the entire space here is the padding bottom. So if we should put this on left and right, you would also notice a difference. So let's start with the left. The left would also be 40 pixels. And yeah, now you can see. So now you can see basically that we do not have a padding at the top and at the bottom. So the height of the content area is maintained perfectly. The only difference now we have is the fact that we have a padding, sorry, from the left hand side, which is why we have the content area shifting, you know, right hand side inside the screen. So you can see that there's an obvious difference when you don't have the padding top and bottom. The content area height is maintained, but then you would also notice that there's a space around here which actually represents the padding left. So that's basically how the padding left works as an independent property. So lastly, we'll be touching the padding right. Now, this particular one might not be very noticeable because we have a lot of space on the right hand side of the screen. So if I save this and go back to our browser, yes, so like I said, it's not going to be very noticeable because you have a lot of space on the right hand side of the screen. That's, from this particular area down here is a lot of space. But just know one thing: the padding right property is actually set on this element. So just know at the back of your mind that this entire line, that's this entire green space, that's from here to here, is not the content area anymore. The content area probably ends somewhere here. That's where it ends, somewhere here, because we've actually set the padding right to be 40 pixels. So we setting that has actually enabled a padding right on this HTML element. Even though it cannot be something that is, very obvious, just be rest assured that it exists on this element. So I think with that, we now know how each of these independent properties actually work. And we also know that, the padding right isn't a very obvious property because of the amount of space we have on the right hand side of the screen. So normally I would have loved to open developer tool so you would understand better. Do we have that? Okay, let's not go into that. But then in future classes, I would actually show you a section of the web browser where the DOM is actually being rendered, and you would actually see the content area and the padding that that is here that isn't so obvious. You would see it in other classes, but for now let's just leave that. So now we'll be going into the padding property that we are all aware about, since it's what we used in last week's class. But like I said, with this property, it's a shorthand property, so it can actually be used to style all the properties that we just touched now. So for this, we'll be starting with the very first value, which we did last week. We'll have this to be 40 pixels still. You save this. Now you're going to have a padding surrounding the entire element. So yes, this is how it actually looks when you apply a single value to the padding element. So you can see there's a space, an equal amount of space at the top, at the bottom, and at the left hand side of the screen, and also at the right too, even though it's not very obvious. So that's how it works with a single value. Now if we should go into assigning the padding property double values, we would have this to be, let's reduce this to 10 pixels, this would, and this to something obvious, 50 pixels. So as we all know, the first value would affect the top and the bottom, then the second value would affect the right and the left. So you would notice a difference in how they are being displayed on the screen. So yes, this is how it looks like with, two values. So you can see the space top and the bottom, they are equal, which is 10 pixels, but on the left hand side we actually have a huge deal of space, which is 40 pixels. So that's how the padding property works with two values. And also on the right hand side we have the 40 pixels too. I really wish I could show where this could be seen. Okay, it's not here. uh, okay, yeah, so this is what I was trying to show to you guys. So this is actually a part of the web browser where you can actually see how your elements are being, rendered. So as you can see, yes, exactly, this is perfect. Yeah. So now you can see that the CSS padding box that's in light blue color is actually the content area completely. So you can see that, you know, we have we have an equal amount of space on both the right hand side and the left hand side, which is 40 pixels. Let me increase this a little bit. Yes, so this is how the box model is actually going to appear when you inspect it, on your web browser. We'll teach you guys how to do that later on. But then this is how you can actually know if the property you set is working, especially on the right hand side, since it's not very obvious. So now you can see the CSS padding is in a light transparent blue color. That's the content area of this element is in transparent light blue color. And you can also see that the padding we have on the left and on the right hand side of the screen are equal. So now the right padding is obvious, since we can now tell where the content area actually stops. And now you can see the top and the bottom padding are the same, just as the left and the right. So that's how this actually works. So let's move on. So here we'll be using three values. We have 10 pixels, we have 50 pixels. Let's reduce this. I need something obvious. Let's say 60 pixels. And for the bottom, we have that to be 80 pixels. So we'll save this. Yeah, so this is how it actually looks like when you have it to be in three values. So as we all know, the first value affects the padding top, which still maintains its 10 pixels. Then the padding right and left actually has the same amount of space. That's the middle value, which we all know to be 60 pixels. And lastly, we have the padding bottom to be 80 pixels. So going back here, we would actually notice how it is. So you can see we have an equal amount of space here. That's on the right and left side still. But then we have a lot of space at the bottom area, and the least space is at the top because it holds the lowest pixel. That's 10 pixel. So yeah, that's how this works. Okay, and let's just quickly go into the four values for this. So we'd have this to be, okay, let's remove this. So we'd have this to be 10 pixels, 30 pixels, 50 pixels, and 70 pixels. So this way there will be a proper difference between all the paddings. So we'll save this. As you know before, this would actually be represented with the top padding having 10 pixels, the right padding 30 pixels, the bottom padding 50 pixels, and the left padding 70 pixels. So this order works in the order of top right, bottom left. So going back to the browser, you'd notice a significant difference in how it is being rendered. Yeah. So as you can see here, the padding top is actually the smallest padding, which is because it maintains its 10 pixel. Also, we have the padding right, which is 30 pixels, and the padding left, which is 70 pixels. So now you can see there's an obvious difference between this space here and this space here. So there's a difference between the two spaces now. And also the padding bottom, maintains 50 pixels. So that's how the padding shorthand property works. And like I said before, it gives you the power to style each of these paddings however you like it. So you probably have two options now. You can either choose to use the padding shorthand property to style all your paddings to the value you desire, or you can use the independent properties. That's by using the padding bottom, padding top, padding left, padding right. Anyone which is comfortable for you, they will all give you the same result. Only thing is that using the padding shorthand actually saves time, as typing out the padding top, bottom, left, right is actually more, it's time consuming. And imagine if you would have to do that for multiple HTML elements, that would actually take a lot of your time. So the padding shorter is actually better, but then the choice is yours. So let's move on. Yeah, so now we are done with the padding. We'll be diving into the next section of today's class, which is the border section. Yeah. So we talked about this in last week's class about the box model, and we'll also be seeing more about it today in details. So as we all know, the border can be defined as the field that surrounds the padding area. Yeah, so the area we just learnt about just some seconds ago was actually about the padding area. So the border area is the next layer in the box model that that follows up, and it's also in between the padding area and the margin area. So that's like a quick heads up to the last section of today's class, which is the margin. So as we all know, the margin is the outermost layer. So let's move on. Yeah, so the border property is a shorthand property for the following properties. And these properties are the border width, the border style, the border color. Now, we didn't have it to be like the padding area where we had the padding top, padding bottom, left and right. But the truth actually is that it's also the same with borders. The only reason why we don't have the border shortened to be for those properties, because unlike the padding property which has a single type of value, the border property actually has different kinds of values. So because of this, you would actually say it is a shorthand rather for these values than the property it holds. So as you can see, the properties here are the width, the style, and the color. Unlike the padding property, the value for the padding property is just in pixels, which is a single type of property. But here, I mean a single type of unit. But in the border property, we have multiple units. That's the width, the style, and the color. So we'll be seeing how all these are also connected to the other border properties. So first we have the border width. The border width property is used to define the width of the entire border. Yeah, that's basically used to define how thin or how thick you want the border to appear on the screen. So that's what the border width actually does here. Next, we have the border style property, and this particular property is used to define the type of border you want to display on the web page. So as we all know, the border style that is very common is actually the solid style, which gives you a particular line outrightly. But then there are other styles you could have. There's the dashed, there's the dotted. We'll be seeing those other styles when we get to the practical section of this part. And lastly, we have the border color property. Yeah. So from border color, we already know what this property is used for. And of course, you guessed correct. This one is used to set the color of the entire border. And this particular property actually accepts all color formats. Yeah, so we've already talked about the various color formats we have, the named color format, the RGB color format, the RGBA, the hexadecimal value, the the HSL value, and the HSLA value. Already, you know what that means. Hue, saturation, and lightness. So this property accepts all of those color formats. So you could use any color of your choice you want and assign it to this property. So the border property declares its properties in the order of the border width, border style, and border color. Yes. So as you can see in this example, we have the border property to be assigned with three different properties. So the 3 pixels here you see actually connotes the border width. Then the dashed here connotes the border style we are using. That's the style of border you would want to display. And lastly, we can see the green color. So this connotes the border color. So this is how the border would actually appear. That's this in this order, starting with the border width, the border style, and then the border color. So the properties discussed can also be used within other properties such as the border top, border bottom, border right, and border left. Yes. So like I said before, unlike the padding, which is a shorthand for these properties directly, the border property is actually a shorthand for this one, but it's also a shorthand for the other properties. So there's a way everything is being mixed. So I think properly you are supposed to have each of these properties under the properties we discussed. That's the border width, the border style, and the border bottom. So by that I mean under the border width, you are going to have the border top, bottom, right, and left. Then under the border style, you would also have the border top, bottom, right, and left. And lastly, under the border color, you would have the border top, bottom, right, and left. So that basically means you would have properties like border top color, border bottom color, border right color, border left color. Just the same way you would also have border top style, border bottom style, border left style, border right style, and then you would have the border top width, the border bottom width, the border right width, and the border left width. So that actually gives you a total of 12 properties when you multiply these properties here with the ones we've already discussed. So that's like a full blend of how they actually appear. So we'll be seeing how all these properties are being used and how the other ones we discussed about are also being, mixed with this one together. So yeah, under this section, we'll be discussing about the properties we had previously, starting with the border top. So the border top property describes the top border of an HTML element. And with this property, the top border can be set. Yeah. So this property actually allows you to set the top border to the way you want it. So what this basically means is that if you were to use this property, this particular property can actually accept the border style, border width, and border color within itself, just as the way we have the border shorthand. So you can assign this property with those other properties. Next, we have the border bottom, which is used to define the bottom border of the element. Yeah, we already know how this works. So it basically describes the bottom border of that particular element. Next, we have the border right, which describes the right border of the element, and with this property, the right border can be set. So this property actually styles just the right border without touching any other border. And lastly, we would have the border left property. Yeah. So the border left property describes the left border of the HTML element. And with this property, the left border can be set to any value you want. So a quick one, we can see a pictorial representation of how the borders are being described. We have the border top, that's the arrow above. Also, we have the border bottom, the border left, and the border right. So you can see that within the border section, which has the darkest gray color, within itself it has the padding and the content area. So this is how a box model of the border actually looks like. That's focusing on just the borders alone. This is how it would look like on a box model. Yeah. So yeah, without wasting time, let's see how these properties actually work. I would also see how both category of properties. That's the first one we discussed, the border width, style, and color. We would see how that those properties blend with the other properties, which are the border top, bottom, left, and right. So back to VS Code. Yeah, we're back here again. We'll be using a heading element this time. Use the ID of, let's call this border. Save. Have it hashtag border. Yeah. Okay, so basically have it this way. And let's start with the first section of properties. That's the border width, style, and color. So this will be border. Using the border shorthand, you would have this to be 3 pixels dashed green. That's from the example we had in the slide. So if I save this, you would actually see the difference. Yeah. So this is how it is here for the borders. That's looking at the Sundays here. So this is how we have it for using the border shorthand property. So then let's try using other properties too. So we can have this to be border style. So as we can see, we have the dash, the dotted, the double groove, anyone you want. Okay, let's use double. Okay, yeah, so you can see that the border style has actually changed to double borders. That's double set of lines. So this is how the border style property works as an independent property. This is how it appears on the screen. So let's see what happens if we take the border property away. If we save this, okay, yeah, so this is how the property of border style actually appears by default without using the border property. So you can see that each of these properties can actually be used independently. And so the border style property by default is very thin, and it's also not in green color, it's just in pure black color. So let's also try that with some other properties. Let's say border width. So for the width, we'll have this to be 3, let's say 5 pixels. So you see a thicker border now. Okay, yes, so this is how the border width property works. And mind you, each of these properties actually affects the other border property. That's the border top, bottom, left, and right. Because as you can see, it spans through the entire element. So that's why I said that those other properties with these ones actually, they are mixed together. So it just gives you more power to define how you want to style a particular border, the style you want, the color you want, and the exact width that you want. So and lastly, we would add the border color to this. So for this, we'll be using blue color. Yeah, so you save this. And now we should see a different color. Yes, so now we have a blue double 5 pixel border. So this is how this section of properties work. And like I said before, the border property is a shorthand for these properties. So going back to VS Code, if we were to use the border shorthand to style all three properties, we'd do it this way. We'd say the border starting with the pixels. So we have this to be 5 pixels. Then the style, we have the style here to be double. And lastly, the color, which is blue. So I'm going to comment this ones. Yeah, comment this. Yeah, now I would save this and you would see exactly the same result we had before. So yeah, that's it. It's basically the same. Nothing changes because we follow the particular order that was expected and we used the particular values we had before. So without wasting time, let's quickly look at the other properties we talked about. That's the border top, bottom, left, and right. So for this, we're going to comment this now. Now we'll be looking into the border top. Like I said before, each of these other properties can actually follow the same format as the border shorthand. That's starting with the border width, then followed by the style and then the color. So for the border top, we're going to have this to be, let's say, 4 pixels. Now we'll have the style to be something different. Let's use dashed. And also the color would be, let's use crimson. So if we save this, you should only expect to see changes at the top and not within any other parts of the border. Yeah, so looking at this, we can see a border is above the text of Sundays, and you can see that the border is dashed and it's also 5 pixels. That's 5 pixels in thickness, and then it's also color a color of crimson. So this property only affects the top. So that means we actually have the power to, define any border property we want to that's around the border itself. So next would be going into the border bottom or the border right. Let's go into the right first. For the right, we would have a border width of, let's use something really big, 10 pixels. For the style, we would have this to be solid. I would have the color to be, let's use purple. Yeah. So we save this and go back. Our browser, okay, yeah. So now you can see a big border here in purple color. That's this particular space where I'm hovering on. So that's for the border right. So also we can define the border left. Okay, border left. This would be 8 pixels. Have we not used? Okay, dotted yellow. Yeah. So this will give you a different border on the left hand side, and yes, as you can see, we have this border here, yellow border, using the dotted style, and it's also 7 pixels of width. So and lastly, we have the border bottom. So this would be, let's say, 12 pixels. Let's use something big. Which other border style do we have? I think we have something 3D. Okay, can we see this? Let's check again. Border style. Let's see what we have here. Okay, we have the groove style. So let's use this. We have 12 pixels groove. Okay, We've not used blue for this, so we'll use blue. And yeah, so this gives you a different style of border, a different color, and a different width. So you can see that in each of these properties, that's the border top, the border bottom, the border right, and the border left, we have different styles, different widths, and different colors. So this actually is how you would want to, style it if you choose to, want to have different styles across the border properties. So this is how the border property actually works, and this is how the sub properties also work. So lastly, like I said before, the properties we talked about before, that's the border width, the border style, and color, are also in a way intertwined with the border top, right, left, and bottom. So this is how it actually looks like on VS Code. So you can actually have something like border top top color. Okay, yeah. So now you can see that this property exists on VS Code on its own. So you can see that both sets of properties are actually multiplied with each other, and it actually gives you a particular set of properties you might want to style. So this border top color will actually change the top color of the top of the, oh sorry, would actually change the color of the top border. So if we have this to be black, we should see a difference at the top border, which was already set to be in crimson color. So going back here, you can see now the color changes to black. So just the same way we have this with color, we also have the border top with the border top style. So you can also see that here, border top. Okay, so you can see there's a color, there's a width, there's a style, and you also have that for other properties too. The border right, you have the color, width, and style. Also, you can actually have it however you want. So we also have that for the border left and the border bottom. So I think that's that for borders. Okay, probably lastly, I might just want to talk about the border radius. This property actually affects the edges of your border. So let's see how this works. So we'd have this to be 3 pixels. Okay, so it isn't very obvious here because we use different style of borders. So let's comment all of this. Let's use a proper border. We'll be using the border shorthand for this, and would have this to be solid. If we save and go back to our browser, yes, so we have this now. So you can see that the edges of this border, they are not straight anymore, and that's because we assigned a border radius, which actually makes the thickness to be more, you know more what's it called, more curved, because by default it's actually a straight edge. So if I should remove this border radius, we'd actually see a sharp edge at the borders. Yeah, so as you can see, the edge here is sharp. They're actually not in a curved form. But then by assigning this the border radius, okay, let's use something really obvious. We'll have this to be assigned 10 pixels. So you notice a perfect curve at the edges. So this particular property actually affects the edges of the border, and they can also be used within the border top, the border bottom, left and right also. So if I save this and go back here, you can see now that the border edges are, they are curved. They are all curved. Yeah, so that's how the border radius works. So I believe with this you guys now have a complete knowledge of how the border works, and also you now know that there are two category of properties under the border property, which is the border width, style and color, and also the other section, which is the border top, bottom, left and right. And I believe now we also know that, by blending these two group of properties together, you can actually get a defined property you want. That's like border top color, border bottom style, and all the rest. So let's move on to the last section of today's class. And yes, we're in the last section, which is the border margin. Oh, sorry, not the border margin, which is the margin section, that CSS margin. So the CSS margin can be defined as a field that surrounds the border area of an element. The margin is used to define the space around the HTML element, and the margin also is transparent and has no background color. Yeah, so we already know about this from last week's class when we talked about the box model, and we also saw that the margin wasn't very noticeable because it's very transparent. So the color we'll be able to see is the color of the body of the entire HTML document. So next, the margin property is also a shorthand property for the following properties. And these properties are the margin top, the margin bottom, the margin right, and the margin left. So the margin property lets you style all these properties, in one particular syntax, just as the way we have it in the padding. So next we have the margin top. So the margin top property is used to set the top margin of the HTML elements. Yeah, so the margin top lets you define how you want the top margin to look, and we'll get to see more about this when we get to the coding. Secondly, we have the margin bottom property, which is used to define the bottom margin of the HTML element. So that's how the bottom margin actually works. Third, we have the margin right property. So from this, you already know that this is used to set the right margin of the elements. And then lastly, we have the margin left property, which is used to define the left margin of the HTML elements. So here we have a pictorial representation of how the margin actually appears on every HTML element. So this is a picture of the box model, but here we are focusing more on the margin. And as you can see, we have the margin top, we have the margin bottom, also with the margin left and the margin right. So, and you can also see that within the margin, which is the darkest gray color, you have the border area, the padding, and the content area. So yeah, now the margin shorthand property can be assigned a set of values ranging from 1 to 4 values. Yeah. So the margin and the padding actually have the same forms when it comes to assigning it with values. And as you can see, the margin property, when assigned a single value, that is the margin is equals to 10 pixels as we have here, it will actually affect all the properties within the margin. That's the margin top, the margin bottom, the margin left, and the margin right. We all take that 10 pixels. So secondly, you can also see another occurrence of the margin use having two values. So here, if we have a margin that is assigned two values, that is the margin is 10 pixels and 20 pixels, you would actually have the very first value to be assigned to the top and the bottom margin, and you'd also have the second value to be assigned to the right and the left margin. So it's basically the same way we have it in the padding. Also, when the margin is assigned with three values, that is, the margin is 10 pixels, 20 pixels, and 30 pixels. That's in this example we have here. You would know that the top margin will have 10 pixels. The margin at the middle, that's 20 pixels, will be assigned to the right and the left margin. And then the margin at the bottom would be assigned 30 pixels. Yeah, and lastly, the way it can be assigned here with four values. Oh, another typo. Okay. So this isn't three values, this is rather four values. So here, if the margin is 10 pixels, 20, 30, and 40 pixels, it's going to follow the order of top margin, right margin, bottom margin, and left margin. So the top margin here would have 10 pixels, right margin would be assigned 20 pixels, the bottom margin would be assigned 30 pixels, and the left margin would be assigned 40 pixels. So basically, the margin and the padding working almost the same way. The only difference is the property name themselves, which is margin and padding. So that basically means that if you understood how the padding works, you would also understand how the margin works. But then let's just quickly see how the margin works. Yeah. So we'll be going back to VS Code for this section. So here, without wasting our time, we would use the last heading element. Have this an ID called margin. So this is the ID name. So we'd reference this in our CSS file. And now we would go straight into using the margin. So okay, without touching anything yet. So this is how we have the Mondays. That's this particular text here, which is rendered by the heading 2 element. This is how we have it. So now, as we all know, the margin is transparent, which is why you wouldn't notice any change in the color. Okay, for the sake of this, would actually have this on one screen. I would actually have our VS Code on another screen, so we'd actually see how the margin you know works. So for this, we'll be having the margin top to be 60 pixels. Now, the moment I save this, you would see an obvious difference on the left side of the screen, and you'll notice that the text of Mondays, that's this text here, would actually come down a bit, which shows that the margin top was set for this element. So saving this now, yeah. So you can see that the Monday now appears somewhere closer, you know, closer down to the screen. So that's how the margin top actually works. And if we change this to bottom, okay, we'll scroll down. If we change this to bottom, you would have the same thing. But now you would have a lot of space at the bottom of the screen. I mean, at the bottom of this text. Yeah. So you can see there's now a particular amount of space that has been created here, which is denoted by the margin bottom. So without wasting time, let's quickly touch the margin left, which would be very obvious because the text would actually move, to the right hand side, not like to the right, but it will move to the right 60 pixels. So if I save this, yeah, so we have the Mondays. That's, you can see it now, it has moved from the left hand side 60 pixels right. So that's how we have it for margin left. And lastly, margin right, if we save this, well, as we all know, most properties on the right are not very obvious, especially the padding and the margin. But then, one thing you should know is that the moment you set this particular property, it actually works. though it might not be noticeable, but just be rest assured that the margin right for this element has been set. So without wasting time, let's quickly look at the margin shorthand, starting with a single value, 30 pixels, we save, yeah. So we have this affecting the entire properties of the margin, which is the margin top, bottom, left, and right. So using two values, 60 pixels, if we save this, the first value affects the top and the bottom, and the second value affects the right and the left, which is why you notice the text move, another 30 pixels towards the right hand side of the screen. So that's how the margin works with two values. Okay, we'll also touch the three values occurrence, which the first value would be affected at the top, the 60 pixels will be for the right and left, and then the 80 will be at the bottom. So if we save this, okay, now we have a lot of space here. So that's how we have it using three values. And lastly, if you have it to be, let's say, 120 pixels, which is four values, the first value would be affected at the top, then the next value would be at the right, the third value would affect the bottom, and the left hand side will be affected by the last value. So now we should expect to see the Monday's text move even is some spaces towards the right again. So if I save this, okay, yeah, so we have this, 120 pixels from the left. So that's how the margin shorthand property works. So I believe with this now we've concluded today's class with learning about the
Sorry, I can
margin.
see your screen now.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I said before we're discussing about the margin um section. So now we apply the four values to this margin property here. So I said the first value affects the top margin. The second value, which is 60 pixels, affects the right of the right margin of this particular element here. And then the next value, which is the 80 pixels, affects the bottom, and 120 pixels affects the right. So the order the margin follows is also the same with the padding. They follow the same order of top right, bottom left. That's when these properties are assigned for values. So I hope with today's class we've gotten, an in-depth knowledge of how the padding, border, and margin actually works, and we've also gotten to know that within the border we also have some very very specific type of properties when you bring the groups of border properties together. So that's that for the today's class. So yeah.